the stars be with you.
All right, I'm so happy to welcome this week's guest, Evelyn Von Zuel. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yay! And Evelyn came to me via Annalisa Six, who's been on the podcast a couple times, and she was like, "Oh, you have to meet my friend Evelyn. She's amazing. You know, we could yada yada." And here she is. So, Evelyn, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started.
A little bit about myself. I am an astrologer. I've been working as an astrologer professionally for the past, I think, 2 to 3 years. I've been studying for about 5 to 6 years. I live in the desert in Southern California by Joshua Tree. It's called Yucca Valley. And I live and work in the desert.
Yeah, how it's, I know. I kind of associate with being in the desert because really, you know, when you're in Southern California, you're in the desert or you're in a land that's cultivated not to be the desert, but still has that desert vibe.
Right.
And I mean, have you lived in the desert your whole life?
No, I'm from Chicago. Well, I've lived all over the place, but I'm mostly from Chicago. Went to school for photography in Chicago, and then moved out to California like in 2014. So not that long ago, and I lived in LA for a couple of years and then transplanted out here. So it's been a big, huge shift and change for the past, I would say, 7 years. I'm a totally different person, like totally different path. And going from one study of light to the other. It has been a really fascinating process of self-journey and exploration.
Yeah, and how perfect is that you said it's 7 years as today we are going to talk about Saturn, the reality of restriction. That's the title I came up with, and that's not the only thing Saturn brings, of course, but that's the first thing that came to mind. And I love how you say 7 years because essentially 7 years fits into a Saturn cycle, which we'll kind of talk and touch upon as we go forth here. And I thought it was perfect, you know, because obviously we have Saturn in Capricorn now. And then Evelyn you were born with Saturn in Sag, right? And then I was Saturn in Virgo. So we got some different Saturnian views to like pull upon within all this. But before we kind of started talking about Saturn and its archetype and like what's Saturn? And why do I need to know? Let's talk about, we are recording this a few days before our full moon in Aries, which is coming early in the week. And I touched on it a little bit in the last episode with Jack. But Evelyn, do you have any insights to this early week's full moon and its Saturn influence going on?
Yeah, it's a pretty, well, of course, everything is a big, all planetary aspects are a big aspect, right? Like
I know.
It's never going to be not exciting in the sky. But the coming full moon is going to be making some stressful aspects to Saturn, who's conjunct Vesta, which happens every 4 years or so. So the last Saturn-Vesta conjunction was in Scorpio in 2014 of September. And so this is another big cycle that's coming to fruition and also a close, but also a new beginning because, you know, there's no such thing as an ending without a beginning. They're both synonymous with each other, I believe.
Yeah.
Just different feelings. And then also the moon will be conjunct Chiron, which is so beautifully explained in the Rising Kundalini and Astrology book as the rainbow bridge between Saturn and the outer planets. So Saturn is making a square to the moon and Chiron, its bridge, which will be, I think, aiding in bridging the polarity between that self-identification and individuation and other. And also the since Chiron is a warrior, is fighting for what you believe in, sticking up for your beliefs, sticking up for your true identity, and not really, I guess, worrying too much about the other. But then there's this whole other side of the coin where it is identifying self in other and saying, I am you and you are me. And how are our frustrations the same, but being manifest as a reflection to each other to learn and grow and move on from. So that's what I see being very prevalent with this full moon coming up.
I like that. I love because it's true, that Saturnian element coming in to square the sun and the moon in Libra and Aries respectively can be frustrating. Like, I like how you point out, like, we might be frustrated with each other, or, that relating dynamic that we're, become consciously aware of once the sun moves into Libra, because that's essentially what Libra does. It reflects back from the other so that you can better understand yourself and then the other in the process, and then kind of meet in the middle. And yeah, we are probably all just going to be frustrated to some extent at this time, because Saturn can bring that type of energy. So I definitely think that's an astute observation. And I'm curious about this, you said Vesta's conjunct Saturn. And I don't work with the asteroids too often. I do work with Chiron. And so, I mean, I know Vesta, that Vestal Virgin energy, the woman to herself, that kind of virgin energy. But how would you play that into Saturn, you think, to help me understand how it might play in a little more?
So Vesta in conjunction with Saturn really is bringing up to me a lot of what's going on politically with women's sexual rights. And how it is not just about women's sexual rights, but identifying and realizing that it's about humans' sexual rights and the sacred sexuality between self and other, between the relating between those two entities, and the morality between it. Like, what is moral, what is just, what is right, what is within the law of nature and what is without, and how do we define what is natural law regarding sacred sexuality moving forward? And is that something that is personal, or is that something that is governed by an external authority?
That part right there. Yeah, highlight that part, which it shouldn't be. I don't think that a government should be regulating anybody's personal, bodily effects in any way. And it's interesting to think what would drive someone to think that they would even want to control that in another to begin with. Like, what motivates that? So, yeah, I don't have an answer. I mean, maybe I do, but that's not the topic of this show. But I like that. And that seems to fit in nicely. Jupiter and Scorpio fits in nicely for those types of things. And so does Uranus and Taurus. So it's kind of like this perfect little cosmic cocktail that's coming together to really help us women, get the message across of what is and isn't acceptable, and bringing things to light that have just been, buried down for since the beginning of time. No, I don't know, but it is a revolution, and I'm very excited for it.
Yeah, same here. The sense of authority too is, I think, a big theme, especially with Saturn, of course, because we consider him to be this ruling person or deity archetype that governs our sense of time and our relationship to time, but then that also dictates laws and regulations within our lives because it creates limitations for what we can and cannot achieve. But so in the Esoteric Book Club that I host, we were reading Occult Preparations for a New Age by Dane Rudyard. And the way that he explains authority was so eloquent and beautiful that totally changed my perception of it. Because I think a lot of like Uranian types and Saturn and Sagittarius, like me, have a difficult relationship with authority, an external authority, or something that's like, no, you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm going to tell me what to do, even if I know it's the right thing to do for myself.
Yeah.
Just that I want to be the one to come to that conclusion. And Dane Rudyard writes that authority is not an external figure putting rules and regulations over you, but it's a sense of authorship over your own life, being the author of your own story and bringing back that sense of inner authority, creating it for yourself. But what we do is we give our sense of authorship away to others, whether it's through laziness, or we don't feel like we have the right credentials, or we just don't think that we're valuable enough for whatever reason to make these sorts of decisions for ourselves, or that we just can't in some way. And so like that sense of free will and comes into play with Saturn as well. It's like, because I feel like once you get to your return, you feel a more greater sense of free will. Like, I'm really I'm really doing this now. Whatever my life is coming into existence as, it's me. Like, it's my responsibility. It's not someone else.
And that's exactly what it comes down to, right? Like at the Saturn return, you realize with that conjunction that it is your responsibility. And that's why people tend to grow up or are faced with circumstances at that time in life that can seem rather hard. Saturn gets a bad rap for bringing forth, hard and difficult circumstances into your life. But really it's for those things that you just said to align with the authorship of one's own life and doing what is necessary and taking responsibility for how that course is going to then manifest. Because, Saturn is all about it's a great architect. It's about planning and it's about preparation and things along those lines as well. And so we are awakened to that to some extent when we have our Saturn return, which with Saturn and Sag wasn't too long ago. You're like fresh in my memory, I'm sure.
Strong, but yeah. All but a memory.
all but a memory. And it's interesting that you say that, because it's true. When a planet is in a sign that doesn't necessarily go as nicely with its archetype, Sagittarius and Saturn, Jupiter and Saturn Jupiter rules Sagittarius, are basically, they're the opposite ends of the coin. Jupiter expands and Saturn restricts. It's, and so that freedom-loving principle and that coming to one's own terms and knowing what's right on the inside and feeling and connecting with that, and then having that outside authority come in or being placed within that, I can see how that would be difficult, to say the least. I had my own difficulties with Saturn though too, having it in Virgo. And when I had my Saturn return back in, God, how long ago was it now? I want to say 2010, 2011, 2010. I can't even remember. I remember, but I can't remember the dates. And Saturn lends itself a little better in Virgo, just because it's an earth sign. It's Saturn likes hard work. Virgo will work for it. But it can also, Virgo gets caught up in the details of things, obviously, and sometimes to a fault, and so there is a harshness that comes with Saturn in Virgo. I think, but I have Mars square to it, so I have my own, thing with that. So, I mean, how did you experience your Saturn return, or just having Saturn? Does anything significant happen for you, or like a realization?
I quit my job.
Okay.
I have a full-time job. I quit. My Saturn's in the second house, so I quit my sense of financial security, moved to the desert in the middle of almost nowhere for the most part, with population of 25,000 people, got married, and bought a house.
Oh, that's so different from everything.
Yeah.
Experienced all the city living. You say you're from Chicago, right? And then LA, and now you're in this more kind of Sagittarius expansive like area, right? You know, you can, not the same as living in the city, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and really a lot of it is because I like moving out into the desert. There's a sense of freedom here. There's a sense of like, well, when was the last time I saw a cop just driving around town? Like, and then Joshua Tree, they don't even have a council. Like they don't have it's not a, what is it? Like they're under the jurisdiction of the San Bernardino County. So like learning about all this stuff, I was like, yeah, we don't even have cop. We don't even have a police station. Like we don't even have any of that. Like this is what I'm craving right now. Is like a sense of freedom from these really bureaucratic, mundane rules and regulations. It's like, why can't I park here right now? I just need to get about my day and do what I need to do without someone telling me that I have to like move my car 10 feet over there. It's just like, so it was really beautiful. I love it. And now when I go back to Chicago, it's such a different perspective of being in that bureaucracy versus being out of the bureaucracy. And when people come to visit from Chicago, I see it too, where we'll just be going hiking and we'll be like, can we go over? Is it okay if we like go? Like, yeah, you can do anything that you want. Like, well, with respect.
Within, yes, respect and reason, of course. But it's not that same, that just all those little things that occupy our mind, you know, like you said, like if you have to get something done and you're going about your day, but you have to worry about moving your car across the street for street sweeping, like it's all those little, you know, structures of society that add up that cause stress to our lives. And, you know, Saturn can definitely be associated with stress because it reminds us of these limiting forces upon us. So yeah, I think that's actually a beautiful, Saturn return for a Saturn in Sag. Like if anything, you took ownership of your life to like get you, you know, in a spot that's called to, you know, what it is, your own structure, like the structure you would like to see. And so, I like that. I like that a lot.
I mean, it's not, of course, there's a lot of stress and anxiety about like, because when it comes to growing through or breaking through, maybe a learned societal structure, there's so much going on too in terms of self-doubt, self-criticism, self-worth, like wondering if it's even like a good decision, if it's absolutely crazy, and working through those mental processes with those mental limitations is a whole other level. So, yeah. Oh, you were having your square when that was happening.
Oh, my square. It was not. Well, see, okay. So, well, in my chart, it's a tricky business because that's the thing is like when we talk about Saturn returns and then the squares and then the oppositions, they are going to depend, upon the sign that it's in, of course, how we're going to experience it, but also what is the condition of Saturn in our own chart and how are the other planets talking to it? And I happen to be born at a time when Saturn was exactly conjunct the North Node in Virgo, and Mars was exactly square.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, my Saturn comes with a signature for itself that whenever it's activated, however we're looking at that, you know, it's activating these other things along with it. And so the square for me when it was in Sagittarius was rather trying, I have to say. And of course, my solar return coincided at the same time that Saturn was exactly square Saturn and opposite Mars, you know, and so I have that flavor to carry me on through the year. But what was some of the interesting things about that particular time? I will say when I had the conjunction, when I had the Saturn return, that was a time in my life, and this speaks to Virgo qualities, I would definitely say, is I had been a musician earlier in life, and then I went on to be like intense record collector and DJ, and I did that for a long period of time. And we're very, into the music scene and supportive of it. And then I just had one day I realized that I was like, wait, I think I've appreciated long enough, and now it's my time to contribute. And so at the time of my Saturn return, that's when I really started getting serious about developing my skills once again, musically, and, picking up the instrument and making the effort, because I wanted to have my own projects going. And I know I had the talent to do it. I just wasn't putting the effort and hard work in. Damn you, Saturn. Which, having Mars in Gemini, it's hard because we're talking about two mutable signs here that can essentially, ping pong or go back and forth. 1 minute it's important, and the next minute it's like, I'll do that later. And so there's a scattering of energy that could come about, which is not, Saturn's not about that. It wants your focus. Right. And so at that point in my life, I decided that I was going to do the work necessary to get my skill level, Virgo, up to what I would like it to be, so I'd be comfortable to perform, and then arrange groups, because I have that Saturn and North Node in the 11th house. And so I got my bands together, and did all that. Now, when I had the square, here's a testament to the cycle, right? If we're thinking about this, so we were saying about 7 years, right? Between conjunction to square to opposition, square, back around. And so when I had the 7-year square, while I was in Sagittarius, which we just talked about a lot, that is when I started to have problems in the outfits that I had going on. And it actually took a solar eclipse that happened to my North Node and Saturn back in September of 2016. And then everything just fell apart, basically, everything that I had worked for. And so those are those tests, where we essentially, when that square happens, we are tested as to what we've done so far, if it has that sustainability and that endurance necessary, or we're tested with that endurance, or sometimes we can pivot to the next thing that is more worthy of our time. And so that's where I found myself personally in that long-winded, but I was at odds with other people in opposition within that for why it all fell apart. So yes, that's what happened to me. No.
What's your rising sign?
Scorpio. So it's got to be intense,
Yeah. So then so then the North Node was in, what house is your North Node?
In the 11th.
Okay.
If we're looking at whole signs, if you look at Placidus or Coke or anything along those lines, it's technically in the 10th, but later on in the,
okay.
But yeah, no, it's so funny because those moments in hindsight, as we look back upon them, both of us telling these stories, that's when we fully realize what Saturn means to us, right? What its impact is, because I have this, we were just talking before we got on, and hit record, we were talking about the idea of conceptualizing planetary action versus understanding it within the real physical world. And I think these are those moments that we get to actually figure that out or feel that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so. Absolutely. It's one thing to theorize and postulate and philosophize ideas and concepts all day long, but it's totally different going out and living the experience of it.
It'll surprise you, that's because nothing is ever how we imagine it to be. And I mean, that really plays into the whole idea of expectation to begin with, which is a whole interesting topic in itself. And I think Saturn is one of those planets that definitely rearranges our expectations of things. Because if we're talking about a planet that is in its very nature constrictive and limiting for good or for not so good, we get confronted with what we expect from life in those moments, I think.
Mm-hmm. So also with Saturn being the I guess, guiding force of time, or the sense of time, I think that I definitely became more respectful or cognizant of time during my return.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was anything similar to you.
Yes. And because right now it's funny because like you say, it's in that moment when I actually had the return and I decided to step up and put the hard work into my skill set, which paid off because I became quite good. I was happy with what I had done. But the reality of time is what hit me because, like we're thinking Saturn, if it represents that linear idea of life and how we are increasingly, aging every day. There's those moments, those come to home moments with yourself is like, what am I going to do with my life? And, it's passing by. So that awareness of time. And it's so funny because I ended up writing a couple songs that really fit in with those exact things. Like I have a song in one band called Waste of Time, where it's like, there's plenty of time. I'll do it tomorrow. That's what I keep telling myself every day, and that's it, and I would write those songs to myself to remind myself, because I have a Pisces South Node, which can lead to procrastination. Pisces energy can lead to, putting things off for a later date. But we know what that does in the end, right? Nothing gets done. And so to answer your question about the time, really, that's coming into focus for me now that Saturn is in my third house. And especially in Capricorn, because we're talking about a planet that's in dignity now. So if Saturn was aware of time before, Saturn is really aware of time now. And time management is such an important skill in our lives because time is probably the most precious commodity we have, right?
Seemingly, yeah.
Yeah. So how are you with time management in relation to, having Saturn and Sag, where Sag kind of almost has no time to some extent?
Right. I also have Uranus in the second house in Sagittarius. And my Neptune is in the third in Capricorn. So,
that's funny.
I actually came to a very wonderful understanding of time in a philosophical way.
Perfect.
Yeah, especially working with these cycles as an astrologer, you have to understand the literal ticking process of each little planet going around and how long they take and what happens when they do, and little guideposts and whatnot. But Saturn, in terms of time and time management, I actually acquired a lot more time when that happened. Yeah, I've understood now that I can create my own, daily time management. Well, I have to regulate it for myself now. I have to tell myself what I'm going to do at what time, and I have to tell myself okay, I can give myself 2 hours to do this because no one else is doing that for me.
Yeah.
Saturn in second house and Sagittarius too, working for yourself or making money for yourself in some way. And Aries, Scorpio rising for you too, Aries in the sixth house, potentially working for yourself or doing things on your own time frame and your own schedule and not really wanting to be regulated in any way with someone telling you when, what, where. So that has come to that was a beautiful gift, I suppose, of a Saturn return, is acquiring that freedom of being able to manage my own time. But with that, as does come with the responsibility of free will, then is the responsibility of choice and making decisions for yourself.
That's very Saturn as well, making, because when we make a decision about something, we are also deciding against something as well, because usually decisions come with an option or another one or a few options together. But we have to, constrict what it is that we can choose from in order to make that, decisive move. And so, yes, I think that's perfect. And I mean, you're self-employed, right? Or do you, yes. And I have mainly been self-employed throughout my life, or if I've had jobs, I've had some autonomy in it in order to work freely. So that it could be definitely that Aries 6th house for sure. But you're absolutely right, because when you are responsible for yourself, especially in work-related things, and the only boss you have is yourself. You have to wake up to, you being the one that's calling the shots and getting things done, and no one's going to do it for you. And a lot of people find that harder. Like, it's almost easy to kind of succumb to the authority and be like, just tell me what to do.
Yeah. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. I think there's definitely a place for every potential existence, of course, as we are snowflakes and we are unique. But when it comes to, with the placements that we have, for us in particular, being your own boss is like something that we craved growing up, like wanting to break free from that restriction. And then Saturn return comes along, like, okay, well, here you go.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, I didn't realize all the responsibility that came along with being my own boss and being my own authority figure. It's like, I can't cry to myself. Well, I can, but then it's like, well, keep going and moving forward. But in terms of understanding time in a deeper sense, I came to, especially reading more about Saturn and how it is really the last ruling planet of the third dimensional sphere of the elements. So like beyond Saturn, we go into the outer planets, which are bigger than us. It's more than just you. It's more about everything other than you, and existential and spiritual, and your connection with spirit and community and people, basically the bigger you. And this understanding of time that I have now is that I see it more as a spiral rather than a linear thing, which I know there may be a philosophy or a term for it, but I see it as a spiral. And the way that it functions is that we keep moving in that spiral and encountering similar lessons that we met in that same spot in this model before, from on a different plane, but we have acquired more knowledge, awareness, time, life experience. So that lesson is now coming from a different perspective, a different way of understanding it. So I guess the way I see it at this point is multi-dimensional versus like the flat line of like looking at my clock going around and around and around. But
well, no, I love that, because it makes a lot of sense. Because if we think about the Saturn principle, we think of Saturn essentially bringing us into maturity, and maturity comes with age. And if we're revisiting that same time point on a spiral as we ascend through it, we gain wisdom from each time we meet that same point. And that's why, a lot of people that have Saturn heavy in their charts, or, Capricorn, there's a lot that tends to maybe come to you later in life. Like there's a late blooming type of energy. And I fit right into that, like I feel like I didn't even get really going until my Saturn return, when Saturn was like, what are you doing? Wait, come on, let's get this together. And that's something to look forward to, obviously, because, if you're like a fine wine that ripens with age, that's the beauty of Saturn. I'd like to look at it like that. And that really falls into your whole idea of the spiral within it, because we have to meet those same points, but with a new awareness and the wisdom that we've learned along the way. And that's why Saturn can kind of be that wise teacher or mentor. So that makes a lot of sense. I like that. And it's easy to remember too. Like I got the visual.
Yeah.
In there. Now, so this week, and why we're even talking about Saturn in anyways, who wants to talk about Saturn? No, I'm kidding. Well, we talked about that full moon, but we also have the sun obviously meeting its bi-yearly square to Saturn. So, what happens when the sun meets Saturn? Like what in particular? You have any thoughts on those two playing ball with each other?
Well, in the natal chart, when I've seen it manifested in a person, it represents itself as really, really structured expression of whatever the sun is in. So really careful moving forward. Like it's really precise and careful, and it doesn't react without considering, I think, the data and the information first.
Yeah.
Which can, at some points, there's some signs be like, get to the point of missing opportunities because of the caution that is expressed with the Saturn-Sun conjunction, where the emphasis is heavily placed on the structure and the process versus, or like the long term, the like how we're going to get there versus the goal, or not being able to see so much of like the reason why you're doing it anymore in the first place, but so focused on the what.
Yeah, the steps and the responsibility of it all, and what in almost feeling, constantly weighed down by that to some extent. And if we think about the sun just in that solar principle, it's the light that we have to shine, right? And so Saturn, can kind of dim that expression a bit, because even Saturn as a color, it represents black. So if we put like a black filter over our sun, it's like we're wearing sunglasses in a sense. Which can be good to temper that kind of, like like a Saturn Sun conjunction would be manifest differently in each sign, obviously, like that happening in Aries versus that happening in, Virgo are going to be two totally different things. But I think there is kind of that dampening, much like Neptune, because Neptune can do that too, because Neptune is that different principle where things just are, dissolving the light in a way that people might not kind of shine that self more, through that, or like they'll hide their light, versus the Saturn, which hides their light kind of in a different way by being so overly cautious and not willing to maybe stand out as much, and so that could be something as well.
Yeah. And then also I was thinking while you were saying all that, Saturn, maybe I lost it actually.
It'll come back right when we're talking about something else. It always does. It always does. Now Saturn, though, in relation to a transit cycle, is a little bit different than how we deal with it in a natal perspective. And so we have the Sun squaring Saturn this week in a mundane perspective. So, if you have your Sun or your Saturn in the places where the Sun and the Saturn are now, you're definitely going to be feeling it more than most because it's exemplifying that, energy. But, we all have our own specific times of the year where our sun, the sun tests our personal Saturn, basically. And usually I notice that, it starts new cycles of things. Any planet, when it meets in a conjunction, and even in an opposition, depending on how it goes out, we're going to start a new cycle. But it's kind of like that idea of like success versus failure in a way, where we're like, either we're come to like, here's the achievement, or we're like, oh no, this didn't go well. Divert.
And also the potential of holding on to tradition for the sake of tradition when really it's not working anymore. And it's time to make an adjustment to it, when it could be really, really difficult, because going against a tradition it's not just about going against your own personal daily life. It's about going against maybe your father or your mother or your family or a lineage that you're brought up in. And so that too, because this is going right on the equinox for us. So this is coloring the whole season.
Yes.
Going forward with this whole season and the election coming up in the fall, it's about, I think too, this dichotomy between my beliefs and yours, and then that Saturn is making a square, which is a frustration or that need to like come in the middle or come to terms with or make some sort of a resolution between the two, which is like, okay, I know that there's this tradition that's been happening in, like, let's just use Thanksgiving as an example. Like, traditional Thanksgiving has been going on in our family for, you know, whatever, as Americans for generations and generations. But does it really hold the same weight as it once did? And how do we take that tradition and create an identity around it that fits for us now moving forward? So Uranus in Taurus, also going back into Aries soon, creating that tradition around your own identity and with your own community that you've grown into. Because now we're in a culture where we're moving in, you know, there's more nomads. It's more of a nomadic culture. Like, how many people actually still live in the same town that they were born in or that they grew up in? Families move. It's much more common. And so with all the shifting and changing, it's like learning to solidify a tradition that works for you. Like being in Southern California and having Christmas with like snowmen and, you know, it's just so strange. You're like, why don't we make something that works for our environment and where we are now? But we're holding on to that tradition.
Sandman. Oh, no, I think that's a great point, because Saturn definitely plays into the idea of tradition, and so does Capricorn. And so here we have Saturn and Capricorn really bringing that home. And in relation, like, I think it's a great point what you were saying with the elections and the fact that, you know, this equinox is basically setting up an ingress chart that has the signature of the Sun square Saturn. And I believe that the Aries ingress was a cardinal one. So we are paying attention to each particular equinox and solstice ingress. So that's interesting. And it's true. And I mean, it's in the news every day where we're looking at these old traditions and approaches that are trying to be preserved by those in power. And everybody's like, are you freaking crazy? Like, this is not who we are today. You know, we need new legislation. This person isn't right to be a judge. That's a whole other thing. And these issues are coming up, and we are confronted with that. And we're confronted with the limitations of the traditions of our society, and that's being upheld. So I think that's an excellent observation, Evelyn. And an unfortunate one, but you're gonna say.
The opposition point is Cancer too. So we have to think of like, what is the opposition to Saturn and Vesta, and that would be Cancer. So in the home, then we are really going to be feeling this tension.
Yeah.
With our families too, but it's going to be expressed probably in our society and culture, you know, career as well, bosses. Like, are you in line with your boss's beliefs and moral fabric? Like,
that's something my boyfriend talks about every day. Like, he's confronted with those types of things because he's surrounded by people at work that have totally different views than he does. And he's not one to rock the boat per se. But at the same time, he has to engage with that to some extent, you know, to still fit in at work without there being tension that's not even work related, you know, disrupting the job. And if we think about Cancer too, you know, Cancer and Capricorn are very nationalistic signs, you know, like Cancer is going to protect the home, but the home also encompasses the country as well. And so, yes, it's creating quite the signature for our upcoming election, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. You know, and if anything, I think that, you know, I used to go to these meetups, these astrology meetups in LA when I was living there, and I recently went back. And you know, when you go back to something that you haven't been to in a long time, you get a new perspective of it, and you get you're like, oh, okay, this is pretty funny. I didn't realize that this is how, but the meetup was like yeah, we're talking about politics. We're talking about these huge shifts and these huge changes, and it's depressing. And astrology can be depressing because why we look at the squares and the oppositions, because those are the keys to the friction that changes things. Like, it's easier to see the friction of something because that's something that'll manifest more easily and more obvious for us. And we're like talking about racism and sexism and the class divide. And like, man, are we just a happy-go-lucky bunch? Astrologers.
Well, and that sounds like I'm sure there were some Saturn aspects going on for that meeting, because if you think about it, Saturn has, like some of its downfalls are that depressing type of energy, or that, feeling fearful about what is coming down the way, or what we're going to encounter, or feeling like, it's that confinement, much like I heard something the other day, I was transferring a tape of a friend of mine from his mother, and this tape was recorded in the 80s, and she just seemed like a fabulous woman. Anyway, she said, she's like, back in those days, she's like, getting old was like going to jail, it was like getting, age was like confinement. And I was like, how Saturn is that, feeling confined by the aging self, and, in relation to the body, but also in relation to society and where you fit in at that point. And how I was watching a program the other night. I've become obsessed with this program called Castaways, which I'm probably just wasting my time watching it, but there's like all these people stranded on these islands out in the South Pacific, and the whole experiment is they're all on their own, but then they have the choice on whether or not to come together is it about the connection that helps people to survive, or is it anyways. And the one lady that was on there, the only one lady who decided to do it on her own, and she was a 61-year-old woman, out there doing her thing. And she just wanted some time to reflect and it's a confinement in itself. But she was reflecting on her own mother's journey, who was going through dementia. And it shows a little clip of them about her mother coming to terms with her age, and realizing at that point that her sense of individuality and who she was had just kind of dissipated and disappeared. And like with age, you kind of lose that, and you're confined within your own identity of that point. And so I'm not sure where I'm going with the story, but it just, I don't know. I think about those things, and that's depressing.
Her second Saturn return. That's beautiful.
Yes. For the lady that's on the island. And yeah, I had to give it up to her. Like, she's a strong cookie, and just a good energy. Like, but yeah, there were just so many Saturnian principles that were playing out in her story that I could see for sure.
Oh, so beautiful. I love that.
Oh, I know. It's so, Saturn has those things. It has that sense of confinement or depression, or feeling, kind of about life. But at the same time, its virtue lies in the idea of patience and the self-discipline that we were talking about earlier, like, especially if you work for yourself and you're your own authority, and being able to endure a situation through hardship, and then gaining the wisdom through it all. So, we gotta find our playing field there. And that really speaks to now the sun's in Libra, right? And the Libra's always trying to find a balance.
Yeah, soon.
Yes. By the time anybody listens to it, it will be in Libra.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Also with the Saturn element of depression, and it's when you think of Saturn and Capricorn, you really think of the individual pursuit of greatness. And it's, Capricorn, Aries, it's about the individual experience for the most part. When we think of Capricorn too, it's more like the teacher or the boss, or like the one person ruling others in some way, shape, or form. And so yeah, that sense of self-reflection of your own personal inner authority with your own self. Like, so another thing that I did in last year, it was a year ago during my Saturn return, was I did a 10-day silent meditation retreat, which is, it's out here in the desert in 29 Palms. And you go in for 10 days, total silence, total isolation. Well, not isolation. You can't look at anyone else. You really can't acknowledge other people. And there's no reading, there's no writing. It's just you and yourself for 10 days straight. And if we think of the process of the zodiac, like from Sagittarius to Capricorn to Aquarius, Sagittarius is the seeker, the pursuit of some sort of a knowledge that's greater than self, that spiritual awareness in some way. And then Capricorn is identifying possibly with that spiritual higher self. And then Aquarius is identifying with something greater than you. And then Pisces is like the dissolution of self in totality with that spiritual idea. And so in the process of the human evolution cycle too, from Aries all the way to Pisces, then looking at Saturn and Capricorn is going back to that sense of authorship, self-authorship. You are too creating your own process of belief, I feel, and adhering to your own belief systems. And then are those ideals greater than the authoritarian or authoritative society that you live in? And so balancing those two aspects.
That's interesting, Evelyn, because you really are playing into a lot of the progression that our society has gone through since that Saturn was in Sagittarius, and those exact things were coming up, finding authority in one's beliefs and standing behind those in a way that was very outspoken and putting it out there. And now we're being confronted with everything that, rushed forward basically as a populace, as now with Saturn in Capricorn. And we're like, wow, how does this all fit in with, the greater scheme of things? Because it's not just about what I believe, like we have to look at it societally speaking and how this fits in. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Even as simple as the Gregorian calendar. Like, the history of how the Gregorian calendar came to be. That is our time management cycle. And it's a little out of sync with the natural process of the Earth cycles, right? Like January 1st, what even is that? What falls on January 1? Like, where that's in the middle of everything, It kind of doesn't make sense if you follow the planetary cycles and the equinoxes and the solstices. You're like, it just doesn't sync up with the Earth's natural rhythm. Yeah. It's a very man-made, like patriarchal system of understanding time. And it's kind of like taking you out of the natural feminine, right? The process of the Earth.
Kind of lunar cycle and, and then I got you.
Yeah. And so it's like, no, we're going to adhere to these days of the weeks being this on these days, and this is what we're going to follow, and it'll be the time management system for the world. You're like, wow, there's still cultures that go by the moon phases. Like my mom didn't even know what her birthday was because she was born, because in Korea, during that time, they would go under the moon. Like, what moon were you born under? So,
yeah. Well, that bears to mention. Now that is interesting. And that they changed the whole time thing, wasn't it? Because then they realized they were missing some time with the Julian calendar, which was another man-made calendar. And like, they're like, we're missing portions of the day and we have to change this. And really like the beginning of the new year for most people was starting in that March zone and for like the equinox time of life. And then, that's interesting. But I like why you bring it up. Like even your mom has a different sort of birthday, or like reference to time as far as, what we're looking at there. And it bears mentioning when we're talking about Saturn too, at least from, traditional principles of looking at whether or not you're a day chart or a night chart, because Saturn is going to act differently depending on those setups. If you have a day chart, Saturn is, still has that structured authority and that restriction there, but a lot of times it's there to help aid and help us along in structure so that we can reach these kind of like solar principles and goals we're going for. Versus the night chart where, Saturn can really get in the way of a night chart, and it's a night chart malefic. And so that actually helps to kind of, decipher where your Saturn sits within another set of criteria to look at. But, it kind of Saturn reminds me of chakras too, because it doesn't need like a completely bad rap, right? But it's much like a chakra. It can be overactive or it can be underactive. If we have too much structure in our lives and that we can't like ever get out and play and like, we limit ourselves and life becomes depressing because of, these rigid implications we put on things. Or if we don't have any Saturn, we don't necessarily get things, done and like fortify and strengthen our lives in the areas that are important. So we have to cultivate a way to balance it. We got to get that balance on Saturn, because otherwise the extremes don't really help us too much in those areas, I think.
Maybe the full moon will help that out, the balancing.
Yes.
Balance Saturn out and the structures of Saturn, and say, well, let's give a little and we'll take a little, and like, let's think about this from a different perspective, from the other person's perspective, and see how we can come to an agreement that's best for all parties. It's such a Libra of me.
Yes. But hey, it's Libra season. It's time to embrace these types of things and understand them.
Yeah.
And, I feel, Austin Kopak had an excellent article on Saturn in Capricorn. If you go check out his page that I can't remember right now, but I'll put a link in my blog to his write-up, because I found it. He had a lot of good, associations with Saturn and Capricorn. But the one that I really liked the most was he pointed out the Aesop fable of the ant and the grasshopper. If you remember the ant and the grasshopper at all. And it's a very simple story. It's like, basically the grasshopper spent the whole summer singing and dancing and having a good old time while the ants were preparing for winter. And then winter comes around and grasshopper's like, I'm starving. Ants, help me out. And they're like, if they're, no, you didn't do the work. You didn't prepare. And so essentially, I think that's what Saturn and Capricorn is trying to get us to realize, especially on a personal level, on our own life's level, what is it that you're trying to architect in life, and the goals and ambitions that you have for yourself. And within that, how are you planning for the future? How are you, taking responsibility of things in the moment to set yourself up for what's to come, so that you have a solid foundation to work upon. And so we have to ask ourselves at this time, especially when we're confronted with Saturnian type of principles, are we the ant or are we the grasshopper? I hope we're, anting up a little bit here, anteing up, that's funny. But we also need some grasshopper here from time to time too, because, if you're not having a good time and it's all just work, life feels a little dreary.
Yeah, which is usually, this is the time for us to be the grasshopper, right? Because we've been the ant all summer long, working, cultivating, and, through Virgo, getting all the things together and shucking the corn and whatnot.
Shuck that corn. Well, that's a good point, though, because if we're confronted with the Saturn now, once we're in harvest season, we're going to know how much work we've done, really, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I've been a busy little beaver. How about yourself?
Yeah.
She just looks. That's funny. Oh.
Yeah. The summer was really, all the summer, everything was insane. I think it's a general consensus for everyone that was the craziest summer for a lot of us. Living in the desert, going through summer was, very challenging, because it's reversed. So in the winter, like, you know, Saturn rules winter, Capricorn, in the very beginning of it. It's the part where you retreat inward and you know, in a lot of places in the country, people don't leave their house during winter because of snow and it's cold. You don't want to leave, and you just feel more cozy inside. In the summer here, it's reversed, where it's so hot outside that you can't leave. And so you're feeling the space is so restrictive and restricting. It feels very Saturnian out here in the summer, actually, versus winter, where it feels more free to be out and move and explore. And so being confined in the space during all those retrogrades, like working through all of those processes and all the eclipses and everything, it felt like a lot of work on a mental level and an emotional and spiritual level for me.
Yeah.
Versus the hard, diligent, day-to-day, like getting my work done type stuff.
Yeah, well, and work can look different for everyone. You know, it doesn't make that work any less important. You know, like that's. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's not a whole lot of anting going on this last summer. It was pretty rough. On just trying to get things done. Or I actually went back in my diary to look at like some of the Mars square Uranus stuff that I had encountered along the way, and I would just notice how many entries that I wrote where I was like, I was trying to get things done, and like, but I'm still behind and blah blah, and I'm like, first of all, I was like, why am I getting on? I'm in my diary, I'm getting on myself about not, you know, how Capricorn moon is that? But I realized what was happening in those particular moments. And it's so funny, like knowing all this, but not really even applying it to yourself until you hindsight go back and read. And I'm like, well, duh, things were moving at a super fast pace that you can keep up with Mars, you know, and Uranus together, and then throw some retrogrades in there, and you got an extra, you know, cocktail of concrete almost slowing you down.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I fully hear you on that. So now before we go here, let's talk about just quick some tips for working with Saturn. Like I think we talked about earlier, which was a good one, was like being conscious of time management, you know, but you can't procrastinate with Saturn, because otherwise, you know, we have to realize that time is one of our best resources. And I think that that's a good way to like, you know, work with it, or some of the things that we might need to do in order to like cultivate a positive side of Saturn, and get things done in life, is that time management. Any thoughts on tips for Saturn?
I think also, since you're probably already experiencing so much restriction everywhere else in your life in terms of external forces, being very understanding and aware of the process that you're going through, and not being judgmental towards yourself for it all. Because I think that, you know, there's that whole kind of, maybe someone should do some astrological research on this, but, you know, like, the suicide rate of artistic creative artists, you know, at 27 there's the 27 club of, you know, feeling that weight of Saturn coming in to your sphere, and then also having to deal with the harsh criticism and judgment from yourself for not doing what you thought you should have been doing, or not accomplishing what you thought you should have accomplished by that age. And I think that in itself can be one of the hardest things to overcome in a Saturn return, is your own sense of self-worth and criticism and judgments for accomplishment.
I mean, and if anything, that kind of like, hopefully, well, if you can get past that criticism, because that's really another tip for it, is like, don't let reality get you down, right? Because really, like, I think it was Michael Luton, who's hilarious astrologer. I've listened to many tapes of his, and he just makes me laugh so much. But I think it was him that reminded us with Saturn, it's like, it's really, yeah, it's reality, but, you know, reality is essentially the perception you have of it. So, you know, it doesn't have to be a bummer if we just adjust our attitude in a way to realize that it's not only this, you know, like help to, you know, lighten that load a little bit by changing the attitude or our perception of what reality looks like or can look like in the future. So yeah, no, I totally hear you on that.
Yeah. And I think patience.
Oh. Oh, says the Mars square to Saturn. But it's true. Patience is everything, because what Lisa and I were noticing on a couple episodes ago when we were talking about Pluto, and since we've had this conversation, I've come across it on a handful of times myself, is how powerful a 3-day period can be, you know, like even just to get to the next moon sign. So if we can cultivate patience in the moment, especially dealing with Saturn, you know, in a few days' time, we're going to see that influence subside. And that's where that endurance and perseverance and the patience comes in. It's like, you just got to get through it. Just got to get through it.
Even in the moment when you are going through that tough time with Saturn, yeah, like you said, the moon can shift into another sign the next day, and it feels like a totally different energy. And so patience and understanding that it is a phase, and there's phases and there's cycles, and this is just one phase that you'll have to deal with for maybe 2 years or so, and you'll get through it. And after that, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and they don't call it growing pains for nothing.
Yeah.
Like you don't grow out into a new, bigger, brighter shell easily. It requires like pushing out and like getting uncomfortable. You have to feel that discomfort in order to even realize that you're not fitting into that box anymore, that you need a new one and you have outgrown it. And that's also really uncomfortable too with the Saturn, is realizing that you've outgrown a lot of old systems.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That is an excellent point, because yes, that's when that reality can hit, as well as what is no longer, you know, it doesn't resonate with you any longer. You've matured beyond that experience, and now we have to look outside of that. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point. With our good old friend Saturn here. So, you know,
yay,
Saturn! Hey, let's give Saturn a round of applause here. The man who ate his own children, many of his children, and he's a good guy, you know. He's just trying to get through life here. It's like, why does everyone hate me? Yes. So I think we covered some good things around Saturn. You know, we've showed the not so great sides. We've shown the ways you can work with it, because, you know, it still holds value to our lives for sure, as long as we do the work. Yeah. Oh my gosh. All right. So Evelyn, tell people where they can find you, you know, your website, if you got anything going on, that book club you were talking about.
Yeah, that book club. We're starting the Kabbalion on October 11th, and you can follow along with the book club at the hashtag Esoteric Book Club on Instagram. We have that hashtag all to ourselves.
Woo!
Exciting. And I'm on Instagram at astrom.council, astrom.council. Also, that's my website name, so it's the same thing, astromcouncil.com. And yeah, Evelyn Von Zuel. I'm the only one. You can find me on the internet. I'm easy to find.
That's so funny. I'm the same way. No one has my name that I've come across, and it's kind of nice, isn't it? Like, especially, yeah. Just
before I came down here, carved my own little space on the internet.
I love it. It's so perfect. Well, I'll have all those links so that people can find you on my blog as well, so that they know how to get in touch with you. So yes, I thank you so much for joining me today, and a fun talk of Saturn. That's
so much fun.
So much fun. Maybe we'll talk about something more fun next time around. It can be. All right. So where can you find me? Well, you can find me on energeticprinciples.com, and also on Instagram and Facebook at Energetic Principles. And like I said earlier, I will have some of the links. I'll have Evelyn's links. I'll have a link to that Austin Kopach article on Saturn and Capricorn I was talking about, and all that kind of fun stuff at energeticprinciples.com. And I also have my Patreon account where I do, you can get early access to the podcast along with moon horoscopes, and I do a weekly tarot subscription. If you're interested in that, you can find that at patreon.com/energeticprinciples. And if you like what you hear today, share it with a friend. We're in Libra season. It's time to share with others. So tell people that Mel and Evelyn were talking about Saturn. Get it out there. And if you feel so inclined, I greatly accept a nice review on iTunes because it helps you get seen. And I do readings and consultations as well too. So I'll just throw that in there, but you can find that all on my website. But anywho, well, I had a fabulous time talking about Saturn. I hope you did too, Evelyn. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yes, I as well. So hopefully we'll get to hear from you again. Okay, well, until then, thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, may the stars be with you.